Hello, and welcome to the Argos DataBlock Designer training. My name is Jack, and I will be leading the training today. The intended audience for this training is the DataBlock Designer. The prerequisites to this training are Argos Report Viewer and Argos Report Writer trainings. Argos datablocks are SQL-based. You are not required to know SQL, but it is expected that you understand basic query logic. The material in this class is technical in nature, and we will not cover basic definitions. The goal of this training is to demonstrate the functionality available as a DataBlock designer and how to create a data block. We'll be covering the following objectives in this training. We will review what the designer role is. We will create a data block with a form on the dashboard and a report query. We will discuss the functions available within a data block. We will also discuss the capabilities available as a designer. First, we are going to review what a DataBlock designer does. To create reports, there are three things needed: a DataBlock form, the report query, and a report format. First, the DataBlock form narrows the results. Second, the requirements are sent to the database as a SQL query. The query incorporates three things: search parameters, the criteria, and the list of data elements that we want returned. In Argos, the DataBlock form and the report queries is one object, called a data block. The DataBlock designers create the data blocks used by report writers. The dashboard can have a separate query for each object, and most objects or controls have its own separate query. The report query is a separate query from the dashboard objects, and is needed in order to create banded, extract, and CSV reports. If there is no report query, you will not be able to create reports. Let me show you how to create a data block. I'm going to launch Argos and log in as a DataBlock designer role. The data block we are going to create is an address information data block. It's a simple data block that returns basic name and address information and contains both a form query on the dashboard and a report query so reports can be made. To create our data block, create or go to the folder where you want to put the data block in. Click on the data block icon with the blue plus sign under the tabs at the top, or right-click on the folder and select New Data Block. Now I have a new data block, and I can give the data block a name and a description. We recommend names and descriptions be as descriptive as possible. For best practices, the data block should be assigned a connection to the database here. This is the connection that is assigned to the data block, and is the connection your users will use to run their reports. If you choose a connection pool, the user will be given a choice which connection to use within the pool when running the report. Pools are also really useful when you are testing, as they allow you to easily test against different connections without exiting the design window. For purposes of our demonstration, I'm going to select a direct connection to a banner database. Now I can click on Edit here to design the data block. This is the DataBlock design window. I will do a quick review of the features available. Here we have Commit, which is like a save button and allows you to save the changes. Close allows you to exit the design window. There's also the active connection. If a connection wasn't assigned on the DataBlock detail page, you could choose a connection here to test with. However, this does not assign the connection to the data block, it's just a test with. The play icon is a test button to test your dashboard from within the DataBlock design window. The Web View button allows you to test your data block in Argos Web Viewer. In order to use the Web View button, all pending changes have to be committed first, and Argos Web Viewer must be enabled by your Maps administrator. If Argos Web Viewer is not enabled, you will receive a protocol not secure error. Below, we have the Form Design tab and the Report Query tab. In the Form Design area, there are 3 more tabs: the Forms tab, the Properties tab, and the Variables tab. A DataBlock can have more than one form and can use variables to link from one to another. The Properties tab is where the properties of an object are defined. And the Variable tab will list all the variables contained in the DataBlock. So let's get started creating the form. The first object I'm going to add is an image. To do that, I click on the Add Image button, which looks like a picture, and I'll click on the form. There are 3 options from which to retrieve the image. The image is stored in the DataBlock. The image is stored on the server in an accessible location. The image will be retrieved from a variable. I'll choose the first option and click Browse. With the image selected, I'm going to make some changes to the properties in the Properties tab. I'll change the align to client, left 0, top 0, auto size no, and stretch yes. I also want my logo on this page as well. To do that, I'll click on the Add Image button again, and I'll choose the images stored in the DataBlock for my image. And that brings in my image. As you can see, it is cut off and not sized correctly. But I can fix that by going to my properties for this object and choose auto size equals yes. I'm going to move my logo over to the upper right hand corner. I can use this logo as a link to my home page by making the image clickable. In the properties for my image, I have a property option called onClick. The onClick property allows me to assign an onClick event to this image object. And to do this, I'll go to the onClick property by clicking on the ellipsis, and it will bring up a window with the events you can assign. Notice that one of the events is Activate Form, so if I had multiple forms, I could use the onClick property. Notice that one of the events is Activate Form, so if I had multiple forms, I could use the onClick property to switch between forms. But I want to go to a web page, so I'll choose Hyperlink. And then I'll type in the URL I want to go to. Now I've made the image a link to my web page, but my users will have no idea that it is clickable since there is nothing to indicate that the link exists. I can change the cursor to a hand point by changing the cursor property for this object. I'll go ahead and change it to a hand point and commit and test. As I mouse over the image, notice that my cursor changes to a hand point. If I click on the image, it takes me to the eVisions website. Now I want to put a title on the form, and I will do that by clicking on the A icon. The A icon creates a static text label. Once in the form, here are all the properties I can modify for this text label. Let's change the font size to 18. Font name to Arial. Let's make it bold. And we'll change the color to white. To change the text of the object itself, I can do it in the property text box, or I can double click on the object itself. Now let's commit and test. As you can see, we have our new title on the form. Now I want to add my search parameters into this form, but remember when I added the title, I had to change the font and the size from the standard font defaults. I don't want to have to do that for every label and object that I add to the form. So what I can do is add a panel control to my form. The panel control does 2 things. It allows me to group objects and it will also allow me to set font property defaults for those objects that are placed on top of the panel. The panel control is this button that looks like a box with a couple of squares in it. If I clicked on it, I could add it to my form. But instead, I'm going to retrieve a panel template I created from the library. The library is the same library we saw in the report writer training. I'll click on the book icon to get to the library. I'll select my panel and click OK. Now my panel template is added to my form, and it saves me some time as my panel template is already configured with my standards. As you can see, the font size is already 10, the font color is window text, and the font name is Arial. Now I'll add more objects to my panel. The first parameter I'm going to add is a date control, since I may want to search within a certain date. I'll add my label for my parameter first by using the text object. Notice that I didn't have to change the font properties. The object took the panel control properties that we set earlier. I'll type in as of date. Now I'm ready to add my first edit control, and I'll add in a date control, which is this button, which looks like a calendar page. I'll click on the button and then click on my panel. I want to align my object with my label, so I'll use my alignment tools. I'll align my object to the center of my label. I'll also change the default to date property to yes. Users will still be able to change the date, but it will default to today's date. One other thing I want to do is change the variable name. Once you get a few variables placed on the form, it gets difficult to distinguish between date edit 1, date edit 2, etc. You may want to consider a naming convention that works for your institution. Here at eVisions, we use the abbreviation parm for parameter, dt for date, and then a description of the object. So I'll use as of date. Alright, let's commit and test. It looks fine, and today's date populated automatically. Let's move on to the next search parameter. In Banner, addresses can be for either people or companies, so I want to add that to my form as a search parameter. First, I'll add a label for my control box. And I'll change the text to entity type. Next, I'll add a control box, and I'm going to use a drop-down box that restricts users to only one choice, in this case, people or companies. A drop-down box is the icon with a drop-down arrow on its right side. I'll rename the variable to parm for parameter, dd for dropdown, and entity type for the description. I need selections in my dropdown box, and to add those, I'll click on the Choices property and select the ellipsis. And I can either create a list from a SQL statement or type it in manually. Since I only have two choices to enter, I'll do a manual entry. I know the choices in Banner are either C or P for entity type, so I'll type those in as my choices, and I'll use the blue plus sign on the left to add a row. But my users don't necessarily know what the C and the P mean, so I'll add in another column with a description by using the blue plus sign for add column. I'll give my column a name. and then I'll type in the descriptions. Now I have the entity code which I will use in my query, and I have a description that the users will select to make their choices. But before I leave this window, I want to change the name of the main column. Each column is a variable I can use in my SQL code, and main doesn't mean anything for our purposes. So I'll change the name of the column to code by clicking Edit Column. Now when I write a query using this variable, I can reference it by the name of the variable entitytype.code, and this makes a bit more sense than entitytype.main. I'm ready to click Next, and now I can select the column that I want to display to the user, and I'll choose Description. Alright, let's commit and test. My dropdown's looking good, and we have our selections in our dropdown box. Let's move on to our next control box. Now I want to allow my users the ability to search by address types, and this time I want to be able to make multiple selections. The control box I want to use for this is the list box. But first, I'll add a label for my search control box. Now I'll add in my list box. The list box is the icon that looks like a list and has a scroll bar on its side. I'll click on the icon and then on my panel. And I'll give this new one a name. Parm for parameter, LB for list box, and address types for the description. I also need to change the multi-select property to yes. This will allow my users to make multiple selections from this box. I need to create my selections list. I'll double click on the object to get to my choice entry wizard. Since there are many address types, I don't want to type them all in manually, and if they change, I don't want to go back and update this control. So I'm going to choose the SQL statement option to create my selections list. In this screen, I could free type in my SQL query, but I can also build my query using the Visual Designer. To access the Visual Designer, click on the ruler and pencil icon. This is the SQL Build Query tool, which is a visual design editor, and will help create the SQL code for me. I just have to tell it what I want. I can use the buttons up here to show tables, or I can click on the Add Table button if I know the exact name of the table. I would use caution if you are in Banner and you want to use the Show Tables button. Banner has over 3,000 tables, and that will take a long time to generate the view. There are tabs down here where the select and conditionals of the SQL query is built. For our demonstration today, I happen to know which table I want, so I'll click on the Add Table button. This is the STV-ATYP table. It's a validation table which contains my address types. Now you can see all the available columns in the table, and I'll choose the columns I want to put in my list box. Just like with my entity type control box, I want to select the code and the description. I'll use the code when I build my query, and I'll use the description to show my users. I can select my columns by clicking and dragging the variables down to the Select tab. Or I can double click to select it as well. In this instance, I don't want to filter my selection in my where clause since I want all the information returned, but I do want to sort the information, so for now we'll skip the conditional and go directly to the Orderings tab. And I want to order by the description of the code, so I'll double click on the description again. I'll keep the default of ascending, and now my SQL select statement is complete. I'm back to the choice entry window, and you can see the SQL code that the Visual Designer has created. If I click on the Edit Visual Design, I'll go directly back into the Visual Design. But let's say I want to free type, where I can edit the SQL directly. I click on the Edit SQL text link, and I get a warning. The warning message says that if I want to edit the SQL directly, I cannot go back to the Visual Design. I don't want that, so I'm going to click No to get out of the window. If I did choose yes, it will remain in free type going forward. I'll click on Next, and the query returns 2 columns, the code and the description. And just like my single choice drop-down box, I can pick a column to show to the users. I click Finish, and now we can commit and test. Alright, it's looking good. Now I want to add some more advanced search parameters. I would like to allow the users to search by a last name or part of a name. To do that, I can add an edit box. This allows users to type in search data. And like all my other control boxes, the first thing I'm going to do is create a label. Now I can add in my control by clicking on the Edit Box button, which is the icon that looks like the I-beam, and then clicking on my panel to add it. The first thing I'll do is change the variable name, of course. The other property I want to change is the required property. I'm going to change this from yes to no. So this is a little different from my other parameters. The other parameters are required, so the users have to enter in data to run the query. But I don't want the users to be forced to enter in data in the last name search box. This is the reason I changed the required parameter to no. Now I also want to add another way for the users to narrow down their search, by including or excluding inactive addresses. So I can use a simple checkbox for that. A yes will indicate inactive addresses in the result set, or a no will not include inactive addresses. The checkbox icon has a check on it, and I'll drop it into my panel. I'll change the variable name to parm cb inactive addresses. And I'll change the text to include inactive addresses. I'm also going to change the checked value to Y to indicate yes. So when I include this variable in my SQL query, I'll use the Y to indicate that I want to include inactive addresses, and a null to indicate that I do not want to include inactive addresses. Lastly, I'll add in a memo box for a comment section and a label called comment. The memo icon is the icon that looks like a letter, and it is useful for displaying either a large amount of text or for allowing users to add in multiple lines of text. The read-only property for this control defaults to no. and this allows users to enter in text. If you have a complex set of directions or instructions that you want to display to the user in a memo box, and you don't want them to be able to modify or delete it, you could set the property to read only for yes. Now that we have our search parameter, I'm going to rebuild the report query. I want to return both the name and the address information for my query. And since we are working in transactional banner, I will need two tables. The first table is the name information table called SprideIn. All of our address information is in the spreader table, so I'll add that as well. I now have the two tables that I need in my design window, and notice that there is a line connecting them. That line indicates that there's a join, and when I click on it, I can see the join. If we look at our SQL query using the View SQL button, note that the Where clause has been added for us. The join came in automatically because I'm using the data dictionary. The data dictionary is a series of aliases and joins which define the tables. The dictionary is customized by each institution, so you can add your own joins and aliases. There are also pre-built data dictionaries available for download on our co-op. Having the data dictionary with standard aliases makes things easier for report writers because field names are the same between all the different data blocks. We can decide whether we want to use the data dictionary or not by clicking or unclicking the Use Dictionary button here. You can also create your own joins between tables by clicking on a field in one table and dragging it to another. If I click on the join, I can modify it or even add it to the dictionary. There are two ways to add to the dictionary: as a suggestion or as a contribution. A suggestion is a dictionary item that will need to be reviewed and approved by the administrator. A contribution will be added directly to the dictionary so that everyone will be able to use it immediately. And we have one more join to look at. This is a join that is actively working to identify the active SprideIn record. In Banner, the SprideIn table has a record for every individual. This includes inactive and historical records. We typically only want the most recent active record. To remove the other records from the result set, we have to filter on the SprideIn change indicator field. This join has been added to the dictionary, so it is automatically added to our query. So let's get started on filters based on the variables we built on the rest of the form. And we'll get started by actually writing our query. We're going to start with our select statement and choose the information we want to return in the report query. I'll do that by double clicking on the fields that I want to add to my select tab. From my SprideIn table, I'll choose ID, last name, first name, and entity end. From the spreader table, I'll choose ATYP, from date, street 1, city, state, zip, and status indicator. Since we are using the dictionary, the fields came down with aliases already described, but we can change them if we want. We recommend that these remain the same as best practice. These names are what Argos report writers see when they are creating reports. Normally, you shouldn't try to work with multiple conditions at once. We recommend adding in a condition, test, and then edit the query to add in the next condition, etc. But this is a training situation, and I need to move a little faster. I have the entity parameter, so I'll add that in. Notice that when I select the field, I can see the data dictionary description at the bottom of the table. To add it to my where clause, just double click on the field. Now I have the field, but I have to build the condition. I can enter my operator and condition here in the condition row. I will click on the ellipsis to get to the SQL editor. I can type my condition here, or I have a few buttons to help me do this. If I click on the ABC button, I get a list of all the variables in my data block. And if I click on the radio icon, I get a list of all the fields in my tables. Notice that we need to expand the parm dd entity type variable to select our code variable. Now we'll add the from date variable and compare it to the banner data field. And since we want the dates for the addresses to be less than or equal to the date entered by the user, the banner field I'm going to use is Bratter from date. I want my banner data to be less than or equal to my date variable, so my condition is less than or equal to. I'll click on the ABC button to pull in my variable. I now have my condition and I'll click on OK. Next is the address type code, so we will add that in the condition and build our condition. Next, we will add our advanced search parameters. I want to treat our last name slightly different than our other conditions. I don't want the search to be case sensitive, and I also want to search by using part of a name. I'll use the SQL function lower to convert both the banner field data and the user's entered data to lowercase. I also need to add in a wildcard to do this. If I just add in the variable like I did previously, I won't be able to modify it. The field is static. I can fix that by creating a calculated field by manually clicking on the table. And I'll choose calculated. This allows me to free type in the lower function from Oracle. And I'll choose the variable. I go to my blue radio button to pull in the sprite in data field. And I'll close my parentheses. Now that my database data has been converted to lowercase, the next thing I want to do is build my condition for my variable. I'll click on the ellipsis in my conditional field. And in my SQL editor, I'll use like instead of an equal sign. Again, I have to convert my variable data to lower, just like I converted the banner data. So I'll type in lower. And I'll click on my ABC button to add in the edit box variable. Now I have to add in my wildcard, and I'll use pipes that concatenate my variable to the wildcard, which is a single quote, percent, single quote. We still have another parameter to enter, the checkbox parameter for the status indicator, and that is not a simple AND statement like the others, because it requires an OR. The checkbox is checked or the checkbox is not checked. So we have to add in another conditional group to only compare the results of the checkboxes. To add in a new conditional group, click on the blue plus sign and build the condition just like before. I'll add in my status indicator from the Spratter table. My condition for the status indicator is null. Note that I don't have to go into my SQL editor to build a condition. I can always type directly into the little box. My next condition is calculated because I am not using a database field, just a variable from the form. So for this, I'll use an or instead of an and. And I'll pull in my variables using the SQL editor. And in the condition field, I'm going to build my condition. Equal, single quote, y, single quote. And if we look at our SQL, you can see all the conditions we added. All right, so let's commit and test. I'll type in W into my last name search, and our results should only show the last names with W. Notice that I now have a window at the bottom and a Get button. This window will be populated with the results from the dashboard query. All right, and we have our last name starting with W, and we have no inactive addresses. And when we click on it, the inactive addresses will now be included. Now the last thing I want to do is order my results. So we'll go to the ordering tab. And let's order by last name and first name. That's all we need to do, so let's click commit. We can now see the changes we've made. I can also change the number of records returned by changing the max number of records returned. So if you want to test your query without returning thousands of records, you can modify this option. As of Argos 6.3, entering a 0 will return all the records for the report query. And as you can see, we're ordering by last name and first name. We also have the option of returning our results in the DataBlock form. To do that, I'll use the multi-column list box, which is the icon here that looks like it has two columns. I'll click on the icon and then I'll click on my panel. I'll drag it to make it big enough to return my results. Now that I have an area to return my results, I have to build a query. But first, I'll give our parameter a name. Alright, since our query will be built exactly the same way as our report, I'm going to copy our report query over to our form query and modify it slightly. To do that, I'll go back to the report query build wizard. I will click on the copy button from within the Visual Designer. Now I'll go back to my multi-column list box in the Form Design tab and double click on the multi-column list box to paste the query. And I'll use my SQL statement and click on the ruler and pencil icon to get into the SQL builder. Now I can paste my SQL into the multi-column list box query. And I now have all the elements for my SQL, and I can still use the Visual Designer to edit it. That's all we need to do, so let's click OK. This brings us back to the choice entry screen, and I'll click Next. Argos is going to run through all the variables in Validator SQL. You don't need to enter anything, so you can just click OK. And we didn't get any errors, so our SQL is correct. Let's click Finish. If you don't click Finish, you can't save any of your SQL, and your SQL has to be correct for it to save. Let's commit and test to see what we have. When I choose values, notice that it runs every time I modify a parameter. We want to run the query just once, not every single time I make a change. So to resolve this, we will add an action button. We will go back to our form and add in a button that will run the query when it is clicked. The button icon is the icon with a go on it. I'll click on the button icon and add it to my form. And just like with all my variables, I'll rename the button to parm for parameter, bt for button, and run query for description. I'll change the button caption to say something that makes a bit more sense to the user. Now I am ready to modify my query to add in this new variable. So I'll get back into the visual editor by double clicking on my result box. And I'll add a calculated condition that my parm bt run query must not be null. We'll save our changes, and we can test. All right, now the multi-column list box does not run until the report viewer clicks the Run Query button when they have filled out the search parameter. We also have the option of returning a count of our results on the DataBlock form. To do that, we have to create a SQL variable and build a query. SQL variables are fields that contain SQL statements created by the users that do not reside on the parameter form. In the Variables tab, SQL variables are called user variables. SQL variables can also be used to update, insert, and/or delete from a table in a database. Since our count query will be built exactly the same way as our form query, I'm going to copy our multi-column list box query to our SQL variable query and modify it slightly. Before we create our SQL variable, let's add a label for our count. Now I will copy the SQL from the Visual Designer. I just have to click Cancel to get back to our form. Then I'll click on the Variables tab and click on the blue plus sign to add in our variable. We'll use a SQL statement and we'll leave the SQL statement radio button check. And I'll select the ruler and pencil icon to go back into the Visual Designer and paste my query. Now I'll modify our query to get the count. We'll go ahead and remove all the fields but the sprite and ID field from the select statement by clicking on the blue X icon. Now we have to click on the summing icon to get our count. In the summing field, we'll click on the drop-down and select count. And we'll change the alias to record count. We'll now rename our SQL variable. We will now rename our SQL variable by selecting it and right-clicking on it. We'll rename it to SQL_record count. Now to add our count to our form, we will create a DataWhere label. The DataWhere property allows variable data to be used in place of static text for labels, edit boxes, memo fields, and date edit objects. When an object has the DataWhere property set to yes, the text property becomes a drop-down list from which the users can select the data field. The drop-down list includes all of the DataBlock variables and SQL variables for this data block. Let's add our label and select the DataWhere property to yes. And in the text field, we'll select our SQL count variable. All right, let's commit and test. Now our DataWhere label is returning the count of the items in our multi-column list box. Next, we'll discuss the capabilities that are available to the designer. We are able to use all the buttons as a designer. We can cut, copy, paste, delete, import, export, share, manage security, access the library of objects, go to the co-op, the support site, and the in-product help. Notice that some of the icons are gray. That is because they are only available in specific situations. To export a data block, click on the export icon. In the exporting window, we have the option to export the data block and all of its reports. Or we can choose which reports to include in the export. The file name allows you to specify where the data block will be saved. Users can also export saved dashboard settings as well as saved OLAP settings. To import a new data block, we will click on the folder where we would like to import the new data block. Now this dialog appears and we can select which data block we want to select to import. Here in the import screen, I can then select to import the data block and all of its children reports, or only the reports I want to import. We also have the option to retain the original author, the revision history, and creation dates by selecting the appropriate boxes. And after a few seconds, I have my data block and my reports I selected as well. Notice that we have buttons as a designer on the dashboard designer actions tile. Edit, which will allow us to edit the data block. Edit data, which allows us to access the library of access the object XML. Delete, security, which we'll discuss later in the training, and share that we just discussed. Now the next topic I want to go over is schedule and delivery. The schedule and delivery module allows you to automate the running of a report and also assign tasks to the schedule as well. To schedule a report, all I do is highlight the report I want to schedule and click schedule. On the General tab, I can check or uncheck the active button, which activates or deactivates the schedule. The Schedule tab allows me to choose the timing and frequency of when the schedule runs. You can also configure schedules to run only during specified time ranges. The Task tab allows me to select what actions I want to take when the schedule runs. At a minimum, you need 2 tasks: execute the report and save the report. There are 3 actions that can be taken if a report returns 0 records. Process blank report, do not process report, and fail report. The process blank report will continue the report as usual, but the report will have blank results. The do not process report option ends the execution of the report, but it does not generate a failure condition. The fail report will trigger a failure of the schedule and can be used to generate a failure email configured in the Events tab. Now let's elaborate a little bit more about the process and save. The save part of the task name refers to saving the report for the scheduling process to use while it is running. A hard copy file of the report is not saved anywhere from the process and save task. A temp file is created in a temp folder on the server, then deleted immediately after sending. In order to save a hard copy of a report that is scheduled, you can add a copy file task or an FTP task or an email task. From the output format, you can choose an output format. A note about the variable names. The variable names here is the name of the temporary file, and it is used by all the other tasks, and they default to process file name and process file extent. We do not recommend changing these names. Again, we recommend that you keep the default variable names of this temporary file. This does not change the name of the report. If you want to change the name of the report, you could do it in the other tasks. When configuring a schedule report to produce PDF output, you now have the option to the full range of PDF options in the process and save task. These were previously only available when saving a report manually. You are now able to preview the HTML email body as of version 6.2. In order to do this, you will need to add an email task and edit it. You would choose HTML in the dropdown and click on the body. You can now work on your HTML code and preview it by hitting the preview button as such. The Events tab allows you to send an email on success or failure of the schedule. We always recommend configuring the on failure email as best practice so you know if the schedule fails. The email body will also contain the reason for the failure, which helps tremendously in troubleshooting. The API tab is for administrators to set up API calls. Note that once a report is scheduled, the schedule icon appears under the report. Under the scheduler actions, you have 3 options. Edit allows you to edit the schedule, delete deletes the schedule, and run schedule now executes the schedule immediately as though its next scheduled date were the current runtime. Running schedules now has no effect on the next scheduled date of execution. The next thing I want to talk about is security. Remember that security is inherited. Child objects inherit their security properties from their parents, unless it is specifically modified at the child level. Security can be modified at the folder level, DataBlock level, report level, and field level. The most common way to implement security is at the folder level because it is the easiest to maintain. To modify security on a folder, highlight the folder and click on Security. Select the group or user that you want to add. You can now modify the allow or deny permissions for the group or the user that you added. Argos allows DataBlock designers to modify the security, but it is a permission that must be granted by the Maps administrator. As we discussed in the report writer training, security can be modified at the field level, and we will review this in the data block that we have been working with in all of our previous trainings. We will now open up the data block. This key icon allows you to modify security for that field in the select statement. Let's look at the last name because security has been modified. And after clicking last name in groups and users, the groups and users section has everyone and HR. Notice that the read everyone permissions for everyone is denied, and the read permissions for HR is set to allow. This means that the HR group would be able to set the last name, and everyone else is going to be blocked. Let's look at an example of this. Notice that the last name column returns blank. This is because I am not part of the HR group. The next thing I want to talk about is revision control. Revision control allows you to maintain a version history of your data block and reports, along with a record of each version's author and notes. Revision control provides a system for creating and managing multiple versions of the data block and reports. Essentially, it allows you to make and save changes to a report or data block without having to worry about the overwriting the previous version. To set revision control for the object, folder, or report, right-click on the object and select Revision Settings. Here I can enable revision control for the object and its children. The default setting is No, and to enable revision control, I will click on Yes. We can also set the maximum number of revision records to store. Now when I edit the data block, make a change, and commit the change, the revision control box appears. Here we have the option to save the change as a new revision or overwrite the revision we are editing. Additionally, you can identify the revision as the active revision by selecting the active checkbox. Since multiple revisions can be applied to a data block or report, prior to editing or executing the object, you want to be sure that you are accessing the intended revision. The intended data block report should be set as the active revision. We will set this as the active revision and add a note about the change we made. At any time, you can manage the revision of an object. Select the data block, right-click, and select Manage Revision. In the Revision Manager dialog box, the information regarding the revision of the objects are displayed. In the toolbar, the first icon, which looks like an edit dialog box, will allow you to edit the revision selected. A star icon will make the selected revision the active revision. The X icon will delete the selected revision, and the blue arrow will refresh the list of revisions. Please note that the author of a revision is the person who created that revision, not the author of the original object or the person who last modified it. We have now come to the end of the training. Thank you for attending, and have a good day.